My name is Yulia Sion. I'm a researcher and industry expert in haptics and wearable technology. And today I will be discussing social touch and how it can be enabled via haptic technology. And my speaker today is Gijs Huisman. Gijs is assistant professor of embodied interaction at the Faculty of Industrial Design Engineering at Delft University of Technology. And his main focus of interest is related to how our sense of touch plays a role in technology-mediated social interactions, in particular in shaping social presence, intimacy, and empathy. And also recently, as I understand, Gijs joined and became co-director of the TU Delft's Food and Eating Design Lab. So hi Gijs. Thanks for taking this time and chatting with me today. How are you?
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, I'm doing well. It's a busy time. I mean, start of the academic year, start of the semester, but happy to get the chance to talk. You can relate, yeah.
I can. But thanks so much for, taking this time, really. Appreciate it. So, well, since there are not so many hapticians out there in this world, I'd like to start our conversation by actually asking you, how did you get into haptics? Why specifically sense of touch? What did you find there? I mean, anything you'd like to kind of share with us about your career path towards haptics would be great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this was during my PhD, which I did at the University of Twente in the Netherlands, at a computer science group, so human media interaction, the group is called, or was called, I think. I have a background in communication science, so by training, I'm more of a social scientist rather than an engineer or a computer scientist. But I had the opportunity to do a PhD in that group, and this was on a project that was quite open, so there was not a lot of direction to the work that I could do, which as a young PhD is very challenging, but also gives opportunities to explore topics that you find interesting. And so I started work actually more on tangible interaction and tangible user interfaces. But at some point, I think it was reading a paper by Antal Haans and Wijnand IJsselstein, who are from the Eindhoven University of Technology. And this was a paper on mediated social touch. And I thought that idea was really fascinating, and that kind of got the ball rolling. So me looking more into the role of touch in perception in general, but also especially in social interactions. And that topic has kind of stayed with me for the past over 10 years now, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is actually so similar also to my path to haptics research. I'm also from like more social humanitarian kind of areas, humanities, right? And then I moved to haptics, and kind of I also have this interest in social actually touch. But you actually took it very far from like this inspirational paper that you read and towards now, right? So because a lot of your research is related to actually social touch, right? Like social interactions and how haptics can enable it in remote relationship or any other settings, which we'll talk about, which maybe we can even jump into now and basically open up this topic of social touch, right? And I was wondering, like reading your some of your papers on social touch and also your talks on social touch. And we also know, like as you haptician, you design some prototypes, right? Obviously, you know there are certain limitations, right, to technology, haptic technology, actuation technology, but also to the actual sense of touch, right? So our perception of touch is also, and how much information can we actually, take using our skin receptors, right, is also limited. So considering these kind of limitations, or maybe peculiarities, let's call it, what elements of social touch do you think should be or can be reproduced by haptic technology?
Yeah. So I think the sort of paradoxical nature of mediated social touch, or creating social touch experiences where people may be at different places in the world, I think is actually what got me interested in the topic to begin with. There's a sort of strangeness to trying to do that, because of course in naturalistic settings, when people are face to face, touch happens very sort of naturally, in the sense that you don't perhaps think about it too much. It's part of a larger interactive process where facial expressions play a role. The context in which this touch takes place plays a role. I think these are all insights that, as a field focusing on this niche of social touch, we've gotten more interested in and more sensitive to over the years. But those, I think, were some of the challenges that originally drew me into the topic. And so I think at first what a lot of my research was aimed at, and I think this is also something that the field really from the get-go tried to get right, is what are the sort of types of sensations that we can create using haptic technologies. So really focusing on what it feels like, and can we get close to some aspects of how social touch feels through the use of technology. So from my own work, a very concrete example is we've been quite inspired as a part of our research group back then by research into CT afferent nerve fibers. So this neuroscience research that shows this sort of dedicated pathway for affective and social touches. With
basically
receptors.
Pleasant touch, right? It's kind of...
Exactly, yeah. So basically that's pleasant touch, and that's sort of operationalized as this slow stroking touch, to which these CT afferents also respond most vigorously, and align very well with subjective ratings of pleasantness. And so this idea was very inspirational for us to see, okay, if this is sort of a type of touch that signals about social relevance, is that a type of touch that we can somehow reproduce through available technologies? And in our case, this was a very simple type of interface, an array of vibration motors, where we use a specific technique to activate these motors independently, and to make sure that you feel a sort of illusory vibrotactile point move over the skin. Then we could manipulate the velocity at which this point moved over the skin. So also encode in that way sort of movement information, which is very relevant to these type of affective touches. So that was one area that was very inspirational and an interesting type of touch to look into in trying to mediate that through technology.
And how do you think, how large is the gap between the real sensation, let's say, of a stroking gesture or pleasant touch, let's call it generically, right, and the mediated touch that is trying to simulate it in terms of perception and user experience of?
Yeah, I think in this particular case, very large, I would say. So this is a relatively crude implementation that we had with ERMs, eccentric rotating mass vibration motors. So not even the more accurate voice coil type actuators. So in that sense, it was quite far removed. But the interesting thing is we did find some indications that at least this motion information, so the velocity of movement, seemed to influence people's ratings of pleasantness, similar to how that works in actual touch. So I think that's part of my work, is also looking at to what extent can we remove all kinds of things that are present in naturalistic social touch settings, and translate that to very simple technological interactions, and see if some of the experience of touch still remains.
But then there is also kind of an element of the context, right? And people who are senders and receivers of that mediated touch, right, that probably affects a lot, right? Even if we reach the point of 100% simulation, that's, let's say, as pleasant as it gets, as pleasant as the real touch, then how does the meaning, how do you convey the meaning through it, right? Like,
yeah,
how do you go about that, considering the context, people? Have you investigated how the meaning is interpreted?
Yeah, so this is actually a topic that I'm focusing on more recently. So my thinking has moved away a little bit from trying to, find ways of reproducing physical aspects of touch per se. So there are other people doing fantastic work there. But what I think the field is really missing is this idea of how does touch actually unfold in an interaction between people in a naturalistic setting, but also when it is mediated through technologies. And so one of my recent papers sort of addresses that issue from a specific theoretical perspective, where I use 4E cognition theories to argue that we should be looking more into these interactive processes, so the reciprocity of touch. And the point I try to make there is that meaning of touch is actually something that is almost negotiated within the actual interaction, which happens always in a particular context, right? And I think that process of how two people actually create meaning through an interaction, through a technological interaction, I think that's a very fascinating topic. So one example of work that we recently did is we gave people a set of bracelets that they could use to touch each other over distance. So these were app connected. And we basically let them use it for 2 weeks without too many restrictions. And what we wanted to see is how do people sort of integrate these kinds of technologies into their day-to-day communication practices, which of course also feature use of messaging applications and things like that, and seeing what kind of meaning do they attribute to these types of touches within the interaction in that diet.
Can you share results, or they're not ready yet?
Yeah, so I'll have to do this a little bit off the top of my head. So one of the things
just the general, because we don't have that much time, but it would be nice, like the highlights probably.
Yeah, so one thing that was very clear is, these bracelets that we used were not something that worked perfectly. So there was really this element of people trying to work around issues that they experience with the technology. And I'm mentioning that because I think that sort of shows that people are aware that they are in an experiment, right? They are aware that they are part of a study, which is the context of use in that case. And so they make extra effort to make it work. So I think if this was something that you maybe buy, it would not be something that you would be so forgiving towards. So I think that's already an element of how context plays a role. And I think that the main finding is that for people, this was sort of a very low effort way to let the other person know, I'm thinking about you. That's sort of across the board the most mentioned meaning that people assign to this touch. And interestingly, there was also this aspect of reciprocity, which was very present in the data. So participants sort of expected, once they send a touch to another person, to receive one back within a certain time frame. And if they wouldn't receive one back, they would start calling or texting to ask about, hey, where's the touch? Where's the touch back that I'm receiving?
So they got hooked very quickly.
They got hooked in a way, yeah. I think it's also shaping expectations, and I think that's something you only really find out when you give people this technology to actually use within a context, and seeing how these patterns emerge as they interact with this or through this technology. Yeah,
this is very exciting because indeed there is a research gap in terms of like context, right? So we kind of know ways of reproducing. Yeah, they could be better, but there is enough already kind of base. But we don't know much about very specific contexts of use of touch, of mediated touch.
Yeah, so and I think there's a lot of work that says context is important, and I've probably said it somewhere as well. But I'm beginning to doubt how meaningful is saying that, right? Because what is context? How do we define context? And it's more important to think about how context is important rather than stating that it is important, because context can be an infinite number of variables.
Exactly. And then also the question, we can design for all the context out there, right? So probably we also need to be able somewhat kind of categorize context, right, in larger groups, and then see how this unfolds in terms of mediated touch, right?
Yeah, and I think also that to pick up on that, I think the approach we had in this particular study, and one that I'm quite sympathetic to, is that what we try to do with these kinds of technologies is also somehow give people tools that they can then use in whatever way they see fit. So for these bracelets, I've also used them. And one thing that I did was taking public transport, I would touch it to signal, hey, the train arrived and I'll be home in 10 minutes. That was kind of a sort of message that was encoded, not literally in a Morse code type session, but encoded in the sense that it was at a certain time, at a certain moment. And so I think these kinds of patterns that really sort of emerge when you give people this technology and they can shape the use and they can define the context. To me, that's a very interesting approach in coming to grips what contextual factors matter for the people that use the technology.
So basically you want to say, and it's already like a topic of not only social touch, actually, it's about the haptic language, right? Which is a huge area of design, a challenging area for haptics in general, haptic language, how do you design it? So what you want to say, it's probably enough to have for specific areas, I mean, limited, but still, like, it's enough to have one pattern that can be given to people, and people will define how they use this pattern in different contexts, right? So we don't need to design all kinds of different vibrotactile or other types of actuation patterns to mean something separately. We can only have like a couple of them, and then people can use it as they please. Is that something you are hitting at?
I think so. I think at least in part. So I think people can assign meaning to relatively simple types of interactions. I mean, that's also what you see with use of emoji and the type of language that's used in text messaging. But that is not to say that sort of the affordances of the technology don't change the type of interactions and the type of meanings that people can assign to these interactions. So I think through this kind of a bracelet, you will have a different kind of meaning being created in the interaction compared to language, for example, right, which is much richer than this one-dimensional signal. So I think there's definitely a design space to think about how can we create these kinds of tools, and what do the tools allow people to do as part of a mediated social touch interaction. So I think that's an interesting process to think about. What do we put into the technology, and then how is it used and reshaped and contextualized by people? That is an interesting trajectory for research, in my opinion.
Right. So it requires some kind of a lot of studies in situ, right, in the field, basically, which we lack also.
I think so, yeah.
But let's maybe touch upon another context, since we are already talking about different contexts of use. I found another article of yours where you talk about storytelling and touch. So if I'm understanding correctly, this article, basically in this research, you try to explore how mediated touch can influence or maybe enhance the storytelling experience, right? And so some mediated touches were provided during the experiencing of this story, and then you basically kind of investigated how it affected the experience, right? And let me quote a sentence from this study. It says that while touches at emotional story moments, so basically touches were provided at specific key moments, right? And you say while they can distract from the story content, touch in general can implicitly enhance the attention paid to the story content. So it's very interesting sentence, because it's kind of contradicting one point to another, right? So on one hand, it distracts, right, from the story content. On the other hand, implicitly enhances the attention paid to the story. So can you talk more about it? Because I think there is a lot to it in terms of also research, because there is this interesting word that I like, implicitly. Also, how did you get this implicitness and this tension aspect?
Yeah, so I think this paper was a little while ago, but I do remember the study that we read.
Sorry.
That's fine, but I think so. I think it's an interesting point, because again, you could say that the story here provides some context to the touch that you receive, right? So that kind of was the idea behind this, that if we provide these kinds of touches at significant moments during the story where, for example, something emotional happens, does it then sort of create an extra layer or help people to interpret this part of the story as being particularly significant? And we compared this to random activation, so just having touches happen all over the story. And I think part of this being distracted is, of course, also to do with the novelty of this type of listening to a story. We're not used to feeling haptics as we're listening to an audio story, like an audiobook. So that, I think, explains the distracting element. But after longer exposure to this type of story with added haptics, people might be able to, in a sense, forget about the haptics to some extent, and really have that be more as an implicit signal that highlights certain aspects of a story, like this more emotional moment.
So we can actually have some kind of tactile stories, maybe at some point.
Yeah,
or movies. Like I've seen another article somewhere about the kind of movie experience, right? We can also enhance that type of entertainment area of our life. Very interesting. Also, there is another question about context, which was very exciting for me. That's related to your recent joining this food and eating design lab at Delft. So I was curious because I've never done research in this direction, but I was always curious. Haptics and food. Okay, so I don't know if you did some research already in that direction. Maybe not. It's too early. But if yes, or maybe you have some like hypothetical feelings about about that. Maybe can one enhance the other, or any thoughts?
Yeah, so I always sort of jokingly say that this is a hobby that got a bit out of hand. So the focus on food, I like food a lot, cooking and eating out. So I've always had an interest in food, and I had an opportunity to work on this a little bit in a small scale project exploring the use of projection mapping and all kinds of multisensory technologies to enhance or change the experience with food items. And during the pandemic, I've been collaborating with, and actually prior to the pandemic as well, with a group of people that were interested in what we call commensality. So the fact that people eat together. This is, of course, a very rich social context with a lot of etiquettes, very structured behaviors that are there, like the table setting, the rhythm of eating, etc. So these were things that we were interested in and trying to think of what role do technologies play there. And that, of course, matched very well with what people were doing in the pandemic, is sometimes sharing a meal through a video call application, for example. So there was this sort of social element to food that also particularly interested me, and the connection with touch there was not as strong, I think, as it could have been. But I think the interesting aspect there is that food and eating together is this highly multisensory experience that does feature touch, that does feature proximity of other people. And so I think a major challenge is, can you translate some of these aspects again to a technology-mediated setting? We have visual feedback of eating, we have auditory feedback, but those might not always be pleasant. So is there a way that we can use haptic signaling in creating a connection between people that eat together remotely? So that's one connection between the sort of social aspect of eating and the use of touch or haptics for social communication.
Could it be also physical space, let's say, in these eating spaces?
Yeah, very much so. So thinking about the way that you contextualize the dining setting, for example, right? So there's a lot written about these kind of commensality practices. So again, table setting, etiquettes around dinner that are shaped by the location, the physical shape of the table, for example. So one interesting avenue is looking into these kinds of aspects and seeing what can actually be translated through technologies. Another element that's closer to touch, and this is something we've also published about recently, is disgust experiences in food, which are very interesting and very, again, kind of contradictory on one hand. So stinky cheese, for example, is something that smells bad, but because it smells bad, it tastes good. Yeah. And of course, there's many cultural factors playing a role here, but there's also a very strong connection between touch and disgust. So tactile disgust is a very relevant aspect, again, also related to the pandemic, where the fear of transmission through touch also created these kind of disgust experiences. So that line between disgust and touch is quite strong. And of course, in food, it's the touching of the food with your hands, but also the mouthfeel that can be disgusting, right? So that, I think, is another more fundamental but very interesting avenue of research, looking into this aspect of touch in particular. And the connection between disgust and touch, I think, in the social domain is also something that's relatively underexplored, but might be very, very relevant, right? So being creeped out by someone's touch can also elicit this kind of disgust response.
I wonder, how do you recruit people for this type of studies?
Yeah, I think we would need to have conversations with the ethical committee for that, for sure. Yeah.
But going back to like food and haptics, or maybe other context on haptics, because it's known that haptics can change perception of other modalities, right? So let's say you're listening to some like hard rock music, but at the same time touching some soft pillow, fluffy one, then maybe your experience of music will be softer if your threshold to the rock music is actually, you perceive it as as not a soft music, then maybe a soft pillow can help you to perceive it as softer, for instance. So can this be somehow harnessed towards this kind of food haptic interactions or any other context?
Yeah, so this would be kind of the cross-modal type research that Charles Spence is known for, of course. I'm not 100% aware if there's any studies at this moment that try to modulate, for example, texture experiences by applying vibrations to, let's say, the jaw area. So I do know of the studies that use sound to do that, so modulating the sound of crunchiness to create an experience of stale or fresh crisps in this case. But the use of haptics, I think, in this domain is also very interesting, especially now that we have, let's say, higher or more sophisticated actuators that can produce a wider range of vibration frequencies. So I think that might open up interesting opportunities for augmenting these kind of eating experiences.
Good that you mentioned this actuation technology, because I was about to somehow move us from this very exciting topic of social touch, and because there's so much to talk about, but we have a time limit, so I wanted to move into this direction of design space, actually, and design process for sense of touch, right, or mediated touch. So if you could talk about your design process in general for when you design for social touch, and what aspects of design space do you consider and how? Because, in haptics, it's not a very stable field yet. We don't have standards, golden standards like in visual modalities or visual interfaces. But there are still certain pillars, right, that we can base our design process on. And maybe you can take an example. Let's say if you're designing a special wearable for social food interaction using haptics, and you design it for a specific body part, then maybe how, you have a goal, right, for, let's say, enhance food experience. You have some sort of research questions. So now what will you consider as your, let's say, golden blocks for designing that particular piece of wearable? I mean, hypothetically, but just how do you think as a designer, as a haptician?
Yeah, so I think your remark that, and that's something that I think we say a lot in this field, there's not so much ready-made hardware available. So if I have colleagues that work on sound, they can buy all kinds of speakers and microphones, etc., to run studies. And I think that's much less the case in haptics, where we do have a increasing number of hardware actuators that are quite readily available. But that definitely hasn't always been the case, and it still requires a lot of tinkering. So I think that's definitely one of the starting points in my process always is start from, let's make something small that works. Doesn't have to do anything very special, but use that as a stepping stone for creating more sophisticated experiences. And I always also do that in collaboration with other people. So I'm not an engineer by training, so I can embody ideas in a simple prototype, but I always collaborate with others to bring them to a next level where, more interesting interactions are possible through these technologies. So in my past work, I've used a lot of vibration type of actuators, so ERMs, but also voice coils, simply because, they're cheap, they're quite easy to drive, and they can create a touch experience on different parts of the body in a small form factor. So they're just an easy type of technology to work with. More recently, I've also started collaborating with material scientists in our faculty, so that work on shape memory alloys and magnetic materials. And there we really take a material-driven design approach, that we start from the material and trying to figure out different configurations of the material, and from there think about what could be the applications of this for haptics in this case.
But very very good point. But this is already a side of the technology, right? This is already a point where you're ready to select your actuation technology and embed it. But before this even happens, how do you start a design process, in a sense, right? What do you consider? Body location, the actual interaction, or the type of gesture or touch. because then that would probably lead you to the decision on the actuation technology, right? And where and how many actuators you want to use, right? And how. So would you be able to talk a bit more about the beginning process of the design?
So I think there's two aspects to this. So the material-driven design process that I mentioned is actually sort of flipping that model around, because normally you would say, okay, we have a certain research question, we want to enable, let's say, a CT afferent-like touch. How can we do that in a setup that allows us to experiment with that? And that might then result in this, a vibrotactile array that can generate these kind of motions over the skin. So that I think is really starting from the question that you have and thinking about the available technology that's there. At least that's in my case, the process, and trying to see how we can answer that specific question through a process of prototyping. The material-driven design process that we've used for these smart material haptics is sort of flipping that model around, where we start from the material and then come up with questions to ask, where could this be applied? How could this be applied? What form factor should it be integrated in? So it really starts from the material itself.
Okay,
so these are two different processes. Yeah.
Right. Okay, great. And you mentioned this smart haptics, right? Or you have this technology, textile haptics, I believe it's called, right? Fabric with embedded electronics, right? Can you talk a bit more about this briefly?
Yeah, so this is also work that groups do in our faculty, is really the integration of electronics into fabrics. The work that we did was using these, in this case, shape memory alloys. And again, this was thinking from the material, because shape memory alloys, typically if you want to keep them skin safe, the deformation is only a few percent, right? So it's not that you can create very strong haptic sensations with the standard shape memory alloy shapes that you can get. So this is a process where you really start thinking about how should we shape the metal and what kind of support structures do we use. And this is where textile came in this sense, in that we wanted to create something for people to wear or to touch their skin. So wear on their skin or touch with their hands. And we use these kind of textile structures to enhance the movement of the material itself. So it could exaggerate or accentuate the movement that the metals were able to make. So this was a sort of process of integration and exploration, where we started from this shape memory alloy material and then looked for different materials to act as a supporting structure.
I'm actually very excited about shape memory alloys. I would love to work with them. Never did, but always was curious. Maybe in the future.
I'm lucky with my colleagues that I get a chance to work on this.
Yeah, this is like still not a common thing to do and design. But where do you see the potential for shape memory alloys, like in terms of application scenarios, use cases?
Yeah, so one of the downsides is that the response time of these materials is relatively slow. So for alerting and things like that, it's definitely a challenge. But where they're very interesting is that the sort of movements they make and the touch sensations that they produce feel kind of organic or natural, for lack of a better term. So actually in the domain of affective touch, they might be very interesting, because they create these kind of more natural feeling sensations. Plus they heat up after use. So you can also mimic, if you get the composition of the materials right, this kind of temperature that you might feel from an actual touch of a person. This takes a lot of exploration, and I don't think anyone has been able to do that in a very nicely structured interaction just yet, but the potential is there, I think.
Right, and it takes a lot of energy, right? Like you have to have like a good power bank, I guess.
Exactly, yeah, that's another downside, yeah.
Which leads me to another question, which I never ask any of my speakers during the podcast, but always was it was always in the back of my mind about the sustainability aspect of haptics, right? Because generally it doesn't look very sustainable at the moment, right? Do you have any ideas? Can we actually make haptic technology sustainable? Maybe if not now, maybe later. What is the way to do that? Considering that now we can't even wash if it's a wearable. I mean, some elements we can, but the main parts we cannot. For instance, we cannot reuse some of the stuff. So
This is a very valid question, I think, and definitely something our faculty works on a lot. So this is, I have to admit, something that in my work has not played a big role, although in the background, of course, there's always the consideration for, what are we actually putting into the world in terms of technology that gets used once and then gets discarded. And many actuators have rare earth magnets or materials that are valuable, right? So it's a very good question, but I also think it's very hard to answer from a technology perspective. I would almost be inclined to say we should maybe have less technology, maybe more meaningful technology, and whether that features haptics or not, I think it could, right? If we can create interactions that are truly valuable and meaningful to people, but that's still something to really surface. I think these kinds of valuable interactions that hopefully people will want to use these products, services for a longer period of time. Than a one-off use as a simple gadget, right?
Right. Maybe some reusable modules or something like that. But yeah, it's definitely something to really think about and something to really concentrate on. I think it's the time to do it because, yeah, even the prototyping process, requires a lot of iterations and basically discarding the electronics parts.
Yeah, so I think if I speculate a little bit, one thing that could be interesting is that, now we have individual actuators embedded in a lot of different devices, right? So your smartphone has a separate actuator, your smartwatch might have a separate actuator, your game controller might have a separate actuator. And you could imagine a situation where you just wear one actuator on your wrist that communicates with all your other technologies and then can take over the haptic function of a whole range of different technologies. Of course, this would require very close connection between these different devices, but you could have a very dedicated haptic wearable that can take over the function of all these individual actuators. So these kinds of thinking processes might be more sustainable, at least.
Yeah, we should write it up this idea. Do not forget. Now then, let's move to talk about the future of haptics, since sustainability seems like in the future also, hopefully in the near future. So we can actually transition to the future of haptics topic. And maybe you could, in that topic, you could just talk about the areas where you think haptics can be the most beneficial, right? Or maybe the areas where haptics are unexplored or mostly unexplored, and the most surprising areas for haptics from your point of view.
Yeah, so the sort of obvious answer that this is in social communication. I think there is a large untapped potential there. I know there's been some things that have been tried and discarded, but still, I think if we can do these kinds of studies where we have more insights into the fundamentals of these haptic interactions, how they're shaped in a context and shaped in the interaction between people, I think that can give us really important insights in how to redesign our technologies. It might also take a different view on technologies. I mean, technological landscapes these days are very homogenized to, a few brands of smartphones. And so I think it would be very encouraging to see startups trying out different aspects of haptics and really try to break through with maybe niche products or niche approaches, but that can be very meaningful to people. And I think one thing we've learned from the pandemic, at least, is the importance of touch. I think one of the beautiful things, given the situation, was that people tried to find workarounds to still be able to be physically close to each other, right? So you saw these examples of plastic hugging screens, for example. So people really do look for this meaningful interpersonal touch. And if we can find ways to maybe not replace touch, obviously, because that has a special role in face-to-face interactions, but there might be ways that we can either augment touch or provide touch where it's not possible, as in situations during lockdowns, or people simply living far apart. So I think there's still a space that's very much unexplored there.
Okay, so social touch and all kind of aspects of remote communication, right? Emotional support at a distance, right?
Yeah, and I think the encouraging
like
thing
well-being
is that,
aspects.
Yeah, so I think that's all that I think is all very much connected to this sort of social
Mm-hmm.
affective touch. Is that if we look at the research on touch, we see very clearly that there are all kinds of health and well-being related effects. And conversely, also a lack of touch is also associated with negative effects on well-being and experiences of loneliness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are definitely reasons to try to pursue these affective haptics or social touch type of interactions. And I think one of the sort of interesting things is that we now see virtual reality and augmented reality technologies also creating more spatial interactions. And when you create a spatial interaction, so where you have a sense of distance or proximity to another person, you almost automatically also think about touch, right? And these might not be necessarily haptics or integration with haptics where you actually feel the other person, but something like pseudo haptics, so where a visual impression of touch can also create subjective experiences of touch, is, I think, another really interesting domain, especially in these immersive spatial environments, virtual environments.
Right, right. Interesting. Thank you for sharing this. I think I have a bit of time for my last question, which I really want to ask. Everyone is talking about AI these days, Why should we not talk about it? I think we should also talk. So I think recently you have written about embodied AI at some point, right? And I was wondering, where do you see, like, what kind of opportunities or maybe threats do you see in combining touch with embodied AI systems? Just your brief overview of this, if you have any.
Yeah, so I have to admit, I'm a little bit of an AI skeptic. So I think that's also the project that we had on embodied AI was also to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice with a wonderful group of people. But I think one of the things to always realize that artificial intelligence, it's not artificial because it's based on the actual work of people. And it's not really intelligent.
Exactly.
So I think there's all kinds of images when we talk about AI, and our university does it as well. So I was walking past the banner of one of the opening events for the academic year, and there's this very prototypical female robotic character that's supposed to represent artificial intelligence. And I think that's at least in the way we think about these large language models, is we tend to anthropomorphize them. Exactly. And if you then start adding haptics to it, do you then create a very strange kind of added layer of anthropomorphization where all of a sudden we're thinking about, can AI touch another person to calm them down, for example, in a hospital setting? And I would be very, very skeptical of these kinds of applications. So personally, I would like to see also from our side more critical perspectives on what AI actually is. And being very careful about slapping it on project proposals as a buzzword, for example. So I would say I'm a skeptic.
Yeah, but skepticism comes from the limitations of our kind of understanding, not understanding of AI, but limitations of AI, right? Because
yeah, so I get, of course, there are opportunities and there's much good work there as well. But I think the whole discourse around AI is now very much driven by, there's commercial interests behind it. So the stories about AI taking over the world is, of course, commercially also very interesting to put out there. And I think as scientists and researchers, we should step back a bit and really keep a very reflective and maybe slightly critical perspective on these kinds of technologies, and be open and honest about what they can do, but also very much about what they can't do, and also think about the harms that they do at this point, as well as perhaps some of the opportunities that are there.
Yeah, I think we can finalize this conversation by saying that critical thinking is essential.
Definitely. Yeah, that's always a good one to end on.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. We covered, so many things in such a small period of time, but I hope it kind of sparked some inspiration. Will spark some inspiration in our listeners.
I hope so too.
Again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. It was nice talking.